The Dark Scrolls. The story of Lady Jane Grey does not begin with the brilliance of a crown, but with the quiet arrival of a child into a world already tangled with ambition, suspicion, and the heavy shadows of royalty. Born in October of 1537, in the early autumn light that stretched over the stately halls of Bradgate Park in Leicestershire, she came into a family proud of its bloodline and eager for its place in history. She was the eldest daughter of Henry Grey, Marquess of Dorset, and Frances Brandon, whose lineage linked directly to the Tudor dynasty. Through her mother, Lady Jane was the granddaughter of Mary Tudor, the younger sister of King Henry VIII, which placed her perilously close to the line of succession, a place that promised glory yet carried danger like a concealed blade. Jane's childhood was marked by the contradictions of privilege and restraint. The Grey household was not as grand as the palaces of kings, but it bore the unmistakable air of aristocracy, gilded tapestries, fine manuscripts, and the stern presence of tutors who believed that duty outweighed tenderness. From her earliest years, Jane was groomed not only as a noblewoman, but as an emblem of her family's hopes. Her parents, especially her mother Frances, were not known for softness. They demanded obedience, discipline, and refinement. Affection was rare, correction was frequent. Jane herself would later confess that she found greater comfort in her studies than in the embrace of her family, for learning offered her a sanctuary, while home felt more like a cage. Unlike many children of her time, Jane was granted the privilege of an extraordinary education, and she embraced it with rare devotion. The Reformation had stirred the air across England, and with it came an emphasis on scripture, on the power of words to defend faith and challenge authority. Jane became fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, delving into ancient texts with the hunger of a mind too sharp to be idle. She read the works of Plato and Aristotle, the epistles of St. Paul, and the writings of early church fathers. She corresponded with scholars who marveled at her intellect and praised her as a prodigy, a young girl whose brilliance outshone her years. But Jane was not simply a creature of intellect. She was deeply pious. In an age when religion was both a matter of personal salvation and political allegiance, she gave her loyalty firmly to the Protestant cause. Faith, to Jane, was not an ornament of courtly expectation, but a living, breathing conviction. While other girls might have been preoccupied with gowns or jewels, Jane's solace was in scripture, in prayer, in the certainty that her soul belonged to God. In this way, she stood apart, and it was this steadfastness that would one day seal her fate. Yet for all her learning and her devotion, Jane was still a child who lived within the walls of expectation. She rode in the gardens of Bradgate, her small figure framed by the rolling hills of Leicestershire. But even in these moments of freedom, the whispers of her lineage followed her. She was Tudor blood, and that fact alone made her life a matter not only of her own choosing, but of others' designs. It was in these early years that Jane first encountered the crown, not as a jewel, but as a burden. For King Henry VIII, her great-uncle, had torn England from the Catholic Church, remade its faith, and left behind a trail of wives and children whose legitimacy was often questioned, disputed, or undone by political necessity. The succession was a storm, and Jane's name hovered at its edge, a possibility to be used, a pawn to be moved. Her family knew it, her tutors knew it, and even Jane, in her tender innocence, seemed to sense that her life was not hers alone. She once remarked, in words preserved by those who remembered her, that she considered herself less fortunate than the humblest shepherd's daughter. For though she might wear finer clothes and live in grander halls, she lacked the freedom of a simple heart unbound by duty. By the time Jane was 9 years old, the forces that would shape her destiny were already in motion. King Henry VIII had been dead for some years, and the throne rested in the hands of his young son, Edward VI. Edward, frail and sickly though he was, represented the triumph of Protestant reformers, and those who surrounded him sought to ensure that England remained firmly in the grip of their new faith. Yet Edward's health was poor, and it soon became clear that his reign would not last long. The question of succession loomed again, sharper and more perilous than ever. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, stood next in line, but she was a devout Catholic. To the Protestant lords, her accession promised a return to Rome, a reversal of everything they had fought to build. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, followed after Mary, but her legitimacy was clouded by doubt, and though Protestant in leaning, she was still too far removed from certainty. It was in this atmosphere of fear and calculation that Jane's name emerged as a solution. She was young, innocent, and most importantly, unshakably Protestant. Through her, they could safeguard the Reformation. Through her, they could mold the monarchy in their image. Jane herself was oblivious to the gravity of these designs. At 9 years old, she was still absorbed in her books, still more at ease in the company of Erasmus than of courtiers. Yet the path laid before her was no longer her own. She was married into the Dudley family, bound to Guilford Dudley, the son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the most powerful man in England after the king. The marriage was not one of affection, but of strategy. The Grey and Dudley families, both ambitious, both eager to secure their place in the hierarchy of power, united their fortunes in Jane. To Jane, it was another act of submission to duty, a role to play with the quiet resignation of someone who had long since understood that her desires mattered little. The crown descended upon her not as a gift, but as a chain. When Edward VI's health declined rapidly and his death loomed inevitable, he was persuaded, some say coerced, into altering the line of succession to exclude his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth. Instead, he named Jane as his heir. She was proclaimed Queen of England in July of 1553, still scarcely more than a child, still too young to grasp the weight of the scepter placed in her hand. The moment was meant to be triumphant. Trumpets sounded, proclamations were read, banners unfurled. But in truth, there was little joy. The people of England did not rally to Jane. They knew Mary, they recognized her claim, and their loyalties lay with her. Jane's reign, such as it was, began under the shadow of uncertainty, her throne already trembling beneath her. And Jane herself was not eager to accept it. Accounts tell us that she resisted the crown when it was first offered to her, declaring that she was unfit, that she had neither the desire nor the right to be queen. But resistance was useless. Her parents pressed her, the Dudleys pressed her, and the council declared it was her duty. In tears, she accepted, her fragile frame draped in royal robes that seemed too heavy for her shoulders. At 9 years old, she was no longer the studious girl of Bradgate, but the reluctant monarch of England, thrust into a storm she could neither command nor escape. In those first days, Jane walked the halls of the Tower of London, where tradition dictated that monarchs resided before their coronation. The stone walls echoed with silence, the tapestries whispered of past kings, and Jane's heart trembled with the weight of her new role. She prayed fervently, perhaps more than she ever had before, for guidance, for strength, for deliverance from a fate she had never sought. Yet outside those walls, Mary was gathering her supporters, and the tide of history was already turning. The 9 days that followed would seal Jane's destiny, and though her reign was brief, its tragedy was profound. For a girl who once dreamed only of books and prayer, the crown had become her doom. The Tower of London, where Lady Jane Grey had been brought to prepare for her coronation, became less a palace than a prison of expectation. She was only a girl, her hands more accustomed to holding books than scepters, her lips more familiar with scripture than proclamations. Yet within those walls she was crowned in name, dressed in the silks and velvets of a queen, and called Your Majesty by men who bowed with shallow reverence while already measuring the strength of her position. They called her the rightful heir, the guardian of Protestant England, the chosen successor of King Edward VI. But outside those walls, in the towns and villages, in the fields and marketplaces, the people were already turning toward Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII, whose bloodline was unquestionable and whose claim resonated in their hearts. Jane's first days as queen were filled with an unease she could not shake. She rose each morning surrounded by ladies-in-waiting and tutors who dressed her in regal garments, layers of fabric too heavy for her slight frame. She was paraded through chambers adorned with banners of state, led to sit upon a throne that dwarfed her, while petitions were read and proclamations drafted in her name. Yet each act of statecraft seemed hollow, like a play performed on a stage with no audience. The people did not cheer for her in the streets. The courtiers spoke of loyalty, but their eyes betrayed hesitation. She felt it. She was a queen only within the tower, beyond which her power faded into shadows. Her husband, Guilford Dudley, the young man to whom she had been married for politics rather than love, walked at her side, but even he seemed more like a stranger than a partner. He, too, bore the weight of his family's ambition, though he tried at times to console her. Jane, with her clarity of mind, saw through the illusions. She knew she was not chosen for herself, but for her lineage, for her faith, for the convenience she offered those who feared Mary's return. She was, in truth, a girl caught between powerful families, a lamb garlanded in royal robes, waiting for the wolves to close in. And close in they did. Only days after Jane's proclamation, Mary began to rally supporters. She moved with surprising speed and determination, gathering an army in East Anglia. Nobles, soldiers, and common folk alike joined her cause. She promised continuity, the rightful inheritance of her father's crown, and for many, the prospect of stability after years of turmoil was enough to sway their allegiance. Word spread quickly through London. Mary had the people. The council, who had so loudly proclaimed Jane's reign, began to falter. The same men who knelt before Jane whispered their doubts behind closed doors, calculating whether it was wiser to hold their loyalty or to bend with the wind. Jane knew of these betrayals. She could see the fear etched in the faces of her advisers, hear the hesitation in their voices as news from the countryside grew more alarming. Yet even as her crown slipped, she clung not to ambition, but to faith. In her prayers, she sought guidance not for how to hold the throne, but for how to endure what she sensed was inevitable. She had never wanted to be queen, and now the weight of it threatened to crush her spirit. Still, she bore it with a grace that belied her youth, a grace born not of desire for power, but of the quiet dignity instilled in her by years of study and piety. For 9 days she was queen, 9 fleeting days that history would immortalize as both a reign and a tragedy. 9 days in which she signed documents she scarcely believed in, received courtiers who smiled thinly, and lived in a state of constant dread. Every hour the air in the tower grew heavier with uncertainty, until the very stones seemed to echo with doubt. On the 9th day the council broke. They abandoned her. Those who had once proclaimed her the rightful sovereign now declared allegiance to Mary. Trumpets sounded in London, not for Jane but for Mary Tudor, hailed as the true Queen of England. The people rejoiced in the streets, their cheers rising like a storm that drowned out the fragile claims of the girl in the tower. Jane was summoned, stripped of her crown as swiftly as it had been placed upon her head. No coronation had ever taken place. No ceremony had sealed her reign. She was a queen in name only, a queen of parchment and ambition, undone by the living force of the people's will. And now she was a prisoner. The tower, which had been her palace, became her cage. She was confined to a set of rooms, guarded, her movements restricted. The silks and velvets were replaced with simpler gowns, though she still carried herself with a dignity that astonished those who came near her. Jane did not rage, did not weep endlessly, though surely the weight of her fate pressed heavily upon her heart. Instead, she turned inward, toward her books, her prayers, her God. To her, the collapse of her reign was less a loss of power than the fulfillment of a destiny she had never desired. Yet around her, the world churned with consequences. Her father-in-law, John Dudley, who had orchestrated the coup to place Jane upon the throne, was swiftly arrested and condemned. Her father, Henry Grey, pleaded for mercy, trying desperately to save his daughter from the fury of Queen Mary. At first, Mary was inclined to show compassion. Jane was but a girl, she reasoned, a pawn in the games of men. Mary had no desire to stain her reign with the blood of an innocent child forced into a crown. For a time, it seemed Jane might be spared, left to live her days in confinement, forgotten but alive. Jane herself accepted this possibility with humility. She wrote letters of devotion, read her scriptures, and continued her studies as best she could. Visitors who spoke with her remarked upon her serenity, her composure in the face of despair. It was as if she had retreated entirely from the world's politics, resting instead in the certainty of her faith. She believed, with the conviction of one who had nothing else left, that God's hand guided her fate, whether toward life or death. But politics, cruel and relentless, did not release her. The Dudley family, desperate to regain power, rose in rebellion against Mary. Wyatt's rebellion, as it came to be called, sought to overthrow the Queen and restore Protestant dominance. Jane's father, Henry Grey, became entangled in the plot, a foolish act that sealed his daughter's fate. For though Mary might have spared Jane once, she could not allow her to remain alive as a rallying point for further rebellion. As long as Jane lived, there would be those who whispered of her claim, who might rise in her name. Thus the sentence was passed. Jane Grey, the girl queen, the 9-day monarch, was to die. At not yet 17 years old, she was condemned as a traitor to the crown. The tower that had been her childhood prison now became her final dwelling. She was given days to prepare herself for execution, days in which she prayed more fervently than ever before, writing her last words with a steady hand. And in those final days Jane revealed the depth of her character. She did not flinch from death, did not curse her fate. Instead, she faced it with a calm that awed even her captors. She wrote to her family, urging them to trust in God. She composed meditations on the vanity of earthly crowns, declaring that her true kingdom lay not in England but in heaven. She became, in the eyes of many, less a traitor than a martyr, a child sacrificed upon the altar of power. The morning of her execution dawned cold and gray. The stone of the tower glistened with dew, the air thick with the weight of silence. Jane, dressed in black, walked with quiet steps toward the scaffold prepared for her. The crowd gathered to witness, as was the custom, yet among them there was little jeering. Instead, a hush fell, as if all recognized the tragedy of what was to unfold. But before the blade fell, Jane would speak, words that echoed through time, words that would immortalize her as not just a victim but a voice of faith. Those words and her final moments would belong to history. The pale winter light fell across the grey stones of the Tower of London, filtering into the narrow chambers where Lady Jane Grey awaited her fate. She was not yet 17, but the weight of the world had already pressed her youth into something older, something more solemn. Time in those final days moved strangely. Each hour felt suspended between silence and eternity, as if the world itself held its breath for the young queen who had reigned but 9 days and was now condemned to die. Jane spent much of her time in prayer. The Bible lay open before her, its pages worn by her touch, its words engraved upon her heart. She sought in its verses not escape but understanding, not comfort alone but strength. To those who visited her, she spoke with a calmness that astonished. Guards who expected tears or pleas for mercy found instead a girl whose faith shone with quiet brilliance. "Do not fear for me," she would say softly, "for though my body shall perish, my soul is safe." Even in those dark hours, her mind remained sharp, her words clear. She wrote letters that have survived, testaments to her composure and devotion. To her sister Catherine she sent a moving farewell, urging her to cling to the truth of Scripture, to live a life guided not by vanity or ambition, but by the certainty of God's promises. In that letter, Jane confessed no bitterness, no anger toward those who had used her as a pawn. She spoke instead of the fleeting nature of crowns, of the eternal kingdom that lay beyond death. "Live still to die," she wrote, "that by death you may purchase eternal life." There was a dignity in Jane that lifted her above her circumstances. Those who saw her in those days remarked upon her serenity, her gentleness, and the strength of her faith. She was not defiant in the way of rebels, nor resigned in the way of the broken. She was something else, a quiet flame, burning steadily, illuminating the darkness around her. Yet for all her composure, the reality of her fate pressed closer with each passing day. The scaffold was being prepared, the axe sharpened, the guards instructed. And though Jane did not fear death, she could not help but feel the weight of its imminence. She was, after all, still young, still human, still capable of trembling in the night when the silence of the tower wrapped too tightly around her. In those moments, she clung to her prayers with greater fervor, whispering psalms into the dark, reminding herself that beyond the fear lay freedom. The morning of February 12th, 1554, arrived with a stillness that seemed almost merciful. The sky was overcast, the air cold, the stones damp with mist. Jane rose before dawn, dressed herself in simple garments, and prepared to meet her death. She was led first to witness the execution of her husband, Guilford Dudley. He was taken from the Tower earlier that morning, paraded through the streets to Tower Hill where the public could see him die. Jane, from a window, saw the cart returning, bearing his body back into the fortress. She did not cry aloud, though the sight must have pierced her heart. Quietly, she whispered a prayer for his soul and steadied herself for her own journey. When the hour came, Jane was escorted to the scaffold within the Tower grounds, for Mary feared that the people might riot if Jane were executed before the public. A crowd had still gathered, though smaller, their faces solemn. Some wept openly, others stood in silence, struck by the tragedy of so young and innocent a victim. Jane walked with composure, her head held high, her hands clasped around a small prayer book. She wore a gown of black, her hair uncovered, her face pale but serene. Upon the scaffold, she turned to address the gathered witnesses. Her voice, though soft, carried with clarity, for the silence was absolute. She declared that she had never sought the crown, that it had been thrust upon her by others, and that she accepted her death as just according to the law, though she maintained her innocence of intent. She confessed herself a sinner, as all mortals are, but affirmed her faith in Christ's mercy. "I look to be saved by no other means," she said, "but by the mercy of God in the blood of his only Son, Jesus Christ." Then she knelt, the prayer book still in her hands. She recited a psalm, her voice unwavering, until at last she handed the book to one of her attendants. The executioner, moved by her composure, knelt before her and asked forgiveness. Jane granted it freely, saying, "I pray you dispatch me quickly." A linen cloth was offered to blindfold her, and she accepted it, tying it over her eyes with her own hands. Now, sightless, she reached for the block, but in her disorientation, her hands searched the air, failing to find it. A moment of panic escaped her, and she cried, "What shall I do? Where is it?" A gentle hand guided her, and at last she laid herself upon the block. Her final words, spoken softly, were, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe fell, swift and final, and with it the life of Lady Jane Grey ended. A hush lingered over the scaffold, as though the air itself mourned. Those who witnessed it never forgot the sight of that young girl, facing death with the serenity of a saint. She was only 16, perhaps 17, yet her composure in those final moments etched her memory into history. After her death, her body was laid to rest within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, alongside other victims of the tower. No grand tomb marked her grave, no lavish monument was built to honor her reign. Yet in the hearts of many she became a martyr, a symbol of innocence destroyed by ambition, of faith unbroken by fear. The tragedy of Lady Jane Grey lies not only in the brevity of her reign or the cruelty of her death, but in the inevitability of it all. From the moment of her birth, she had been bound to a destiny shaped by forces beyond her control. Ambitious parents, power-hungry nobles, a kingdom divided by faith. She was never free to choose her path, yet in the end she chose how to face it, with courage, with faith, with dignity. In the years that followed, her story was told and retold, each time casting her as a victim, a saint, or a warning. Painters immortalized her final moments, poets sang of her purity, historians debated her significance. But beyond the legends and the symbols, there remained the image of a young girl, gentle, learned, devout, who had wanted nothing more than a life of study and prayer, and who instead became a queen for 9 days and a martyr forever. Her brief reign and her tragic end revealed the harsh reality of Tudor politics, where crowns were not gifts but weapons, and where the innocent were often sacrificed upon the altar of power. Jane's death did not end the struggles of her time. Mary's reign would bring its own storms, its own fires, its own martyrs. But Jane's memory endured as something different, something untouchable. She was the queen who never wanted to be queen, the girl who walked to her death with the serenity of faith, the child who became immortal in the hearts of those who saw her as a lamb led silently to the slaughter. And so the Tower of London kept her story within its walls, its stones still whispering of the day a young queen walked to the scaffold with grace. The echoes of her footsteps linger, the faint shadow of her voice lingers in the chapel, reminding all who enter that behind the grandeur of crowns lies the fragile heart of those forced to wear them. After the blade fell and the hush lingered over the scaffold, the world did not pause to mourn. The wheels of history turned as they always did, indifferent to the life just extinguished. Yet even in the swift current of time, the memory of Lady Jane Grey began to take root, not as a forgotten victim of politics, but as a figure whose tragedy resonated in ways few could ignore. For those who had witnessed her composure at the Tower, her final words, her calm acceptance of death, she was not merely a condemned traitor, but something closer to a martyr, an emblem of innocence sacrificed in a ruthless game of power. Mary Tudor, newly confirmed as queen, had achieved her rightful inheritance. The people who had cheered her in the streets felt they had restored justice, restored the true heir of Henry VIII. Yet with justice came shadows, for her reign, almost from its beginning, was haunted by the image of the young girl executed in her name. Mary had hesitated to order Jane's death, reluctant to stain her throne with the blood of one so young, but rebellion had forced her hand, and now the act hung over her, a reminder that legitimacy had been secured at a dreadful cost. In the months following Jane's death, whispers traveled across England. Some told of her serenity at the scaffold, how she prayed with such certainty that even hardened guards felt tears sting their eyes. Others spoke of her writings in the Tower, of the letters she left behind, urging her family to cling to faith. These words, copied and passed from hand to hand, began to circulate among Protestants who saw in Jane not a usurper, but a saintly victim of Catholic cruelty. She became, in their hearts, the first great martyr of Mary's reign, a foreshadowing of the fires that would later consume so many under the name of faith. Artists and poets, moved by the pathos of her story, began to weave her image into England's cultural memory. She was portrayed as the young girl queen, pure, innocent, unwilling to grasp at power, forced into it by others, and destroyed for it. Painters depicted her final moments at the scaffold, her slight figure in white, her blindfolded face serene, her hands outstretched, searching for the block. The most famous of these would come centuries later, when Paul Delaroche painted the execution of Lady Jane Grey, capturing her in luminous light, her youth emphasized, her fragility set against the dark severity of the tower walls. In his canvas, Jane became not just a Tudor queen, but an eternal symbol of innocence caught in the jaws of history. But in her own century, her image was equally potent. To Protestants, she was a heroine of faith, her devotion in life and death an inspiration. To Catholics, she was less a martyr than a casualty of ambition, her death tragic, but necessary to secure Mary's rule. Yet even among those who supported Mary, there was often an acknowledgement that Jane's fate was unjust, that she had been too young, too unworldly, too unwilling to deserve such an end. The tragedy of her story lay not in rebellion, but in the innocence of a child forced into the role of monarch. Meanwhile, England moved on. Mary's reign grew darker with time, as her attempt to restore Catholicism led to the persecution of Protestants. Fires burned in Smithfield and Oxford, and the smoke of martyrs rose into the sky, earning her the name Bloody Mary. In that fire, Jane's memory glowed brighter still. She was remembered as the first, the lamb sacrificed before the storm, the gentle figure who had walked to her death, not with cries of defiance, but with quiet faith. Her writings, preserved and circulated, became a testament to her inner strength. Scholars marveled at her command of languages, her clarity of thought, her eloquence in expressing faith. Even as a teenager, she had written with the wisdom of someone far older, and those words gave her life beyond the grave. They painted her not merely as a victim, but as a voice, one whose echo carried through the turbulence of Tudor England. In the decades that followed, Jane's name became a point of reflection, a way to measure the cruelty of ambition and the fragility of innocence. Under Elizabeth I, her cousin, the story of Jane Grey took on a new hue. Elizabeth, Protestant and pragmatic, understood the power of memory. Though she did not canonize Jane in any official way, the tale of the 9-Day Queen remained alive in the culture of her court. Jane's story was told as a warning, as a lesson in the dangers of ambition, and as a quiet justification for Protestant endurance. The tower itself carried her ghost. Visitors spoke of the chill in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where Jane was buried. They imagined her spirit walking through the corridors, a slight figure in gray or white, her face serene, her eyes filled with sorrow. For centuries she was said to haunt the place of her execution, a gentle reminder to all who came after that crowns and power are fleeting, but the cost of them is eternal. Even beyond England, her story spread. European observers, fascinated by the drama of the Tudor succession, recounted the tale of the young queen who ruled for only 9 days. In their telling, Jane became a symbol of the cruelty of dynastic politics, a figure whose fate captured the imagination of those who saw in her story the collision of innocence and tyranny. What made Jane's tragedy endure was not simply the brevity of her reign, but the depth of her humanity. She was not a warrior queen, not a scheming monarch, not even a willing participant in the games of power. She was a child, educated and devout, who longed only for study and prayer, whose life was shaped by forces beyond her control. and in her final moments, she revealed a strength of character that transformed her from pawn to icon. Generations later, the Victorians would revive her memory with new fervor. To them, she was the embodiment of virtue, a young Protestant martyr who stood in contrast to the bloody image of Mary. Delaroche's painting, exhibited in London in the 19th century, drew crowds who wept at the sight of the blindfolded girl at the block. Poets and novelists retold her story, casting her as both saint and victim, her youth and innocence making her tragedy all the more poignant. Jane became, for them, not just a figure of history, but a mirror of their own ideals, piety, purity, sacrifice. But beneath the layers of legend and art, there remained the real Jane, a girl born into a family of ambition, educated with brilliance, caught in the whirlwind of Tudor politics and destroyed by it. Her life was short, her reign shorter, yet the impression she left was indelible. Even today, when we walk through the tower, when we see the worn stones that witnessed her final steps, her story lingers in the air. She reminds us of the human cost of crowns, of the fragility of those who are forced to bear them, and of the quiet strength that can endure even in the face of death. And so Lady Jane Grey, though gone at 15 or 16, became immortal. She was not remembered for the decrees she passed or the policies she enacted, for there were none. She was remembered for her innocence, her learning, her faith, and her composure at the end. In her tragedy, she revealed the truth of monarchy, that power is fleeting, that crowns are heavy, and that those who wear them often pay the highest price. Time moved on, as it always does, swallowing kingdoms, dynasties, and the names of men and women who once held power as if it were eternal. Yet some names do not vanish into the silence of history. They linger like echoes in a vast hall, carried forward by memory and meaning. Lady Jane Grey was one of those names. She had lived scarcely more than 15 or 16 years, ruled for only 9 days, and left the world upon a scaffold within the tower's grey walls. And yet she remained alive in stories, paintings, and the hearts of those who looked upon her tragedy as more than a historical footnote. Her life became a parable, her death a symbol, her memory a mirror in which generations saw the dangers of ambition and the fragility of innocence. In the immediate aftermath of her execution, Jane was a shadow cast across Mary Tudor's reign. Though Mary had secured her throne, the cost lingered in the air. Jane's death became the first great sorrow that hung over her rule, an omen that the years ahead would be marked not by peace but by fire and division. The Marian persecutions that followed, burning Protestants in marketplaces and squares, seemed almost to extend the tragedy that began with Jane's fall. Among Protestants, she was remembered as their first victim, their first saint of that dark chapter, her quiet acceptance of death contrasting with the flames that would consume others. Her story circulated in whispered retellings, her writings preserved like relics. Even when her grave lay unmarked, her name was carved upon hearts as a reminder of the brutality of power and the purity of faith. When Elizabeth ascended the throne after Mary's death, the memory of Jane was softened, reshaped, and woven into a new narrative. Elizabeth, pragmatic and politically astute, could not afford to exalt Jane too openly, for Jane's claim to the throne had once rivaled her own. Yet Jane's story was too compelling to be silenced, too tragic to be ignored. Quietly, under Elizabeth, Jane became an emblem of Protestant virtue, her youth and learning praised, her death mourned, her faith exalted. In this way she became part of the moral fabric of the Elizabethan age, remembered not as a rival, but as a symbol of what it meant to suffer for the true religion. In later centuries, Jane's memory was dressed in layers of romanticism. During the 17th and 18th centuries, writers revisited her tale with growing fascination, portraying her as a heroine of innocence and devotion. She was no longer only the 9 Days Queen. She was the lost child of the Reformation, the figure of virtue destroyed by tyranny. The Victorians, with their taste for morality tales and tragic heroines, embraced her with particular fervor. They painted her as a delicate figure in white, her eyes lifted heavenward, her youth emphasized to the point of myth. In their imagination, Jane was less a historical figure than an eternal archetype, the young, virtuous woman undone by the cruelty of the world. Paul Delaroche's famous painting, The Execution of Lady Jane Grey, captured this vision with haunting beauty. Exhibited in London in the 19th century, it drew crowds who stood in reverent silence before the canvas. There she was, blindfolded, her white gown glowing like light against the dark stone, her hands reaching helplessly for the block. The executioner, massive and shadowed, loomed beside her while attendants supported her fragile form. To those who saw it, the painting was not merely art. It was an experience of grief, of awe, of pity. It fixed Jane forever in the imagination as the gentle child sacrificed to ambition's cruelty. Yet behind all these retellings and portrayals lay the real girl, whose voice survived in her letters, her prayers, her confessions. They reveal a mind too sharp for her age, a heart too serious, a faith too strong to be broken. In her final writings, she spoke not of crowns or thrones, but of the fleeting nature of worldly glory. She saw herself not as a queen undone, but as a Christian soul redeemed. In her words, we glimpse not the myth, but the reality. A child educated beyond her years, who never sought power, who was swept into history's current, and who, at the end, accepted her fate with extraordinary calm. Her legacy continued to ripple outward. For Protestants, she became a martyr, for artists, a muse, for poets, a tragic heroine, for historians, a symbol of the dangers of dynastic politics. She was remembered as the queen who never wanted to be queen, whose reign was too short to bear meaning, but whose death carried more weight than the laws she signed in her 9 days of power. She embodied the truth that power often destroys those least prepared for it, that crowns are gilded with sorrow as much as with gold. Even now, centuries later, when visitors walk through the Tower of London, her presence lingers. In the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she lies buried without grandeur, her name is whispered among those of others who met their end within those walls. Some say her spirit still wanders there, a pale figure drifting through stone corridors, her face serene, her eyes filled with a sorrow too deep for words. Whether ghost or memory, she remains part of that place, inseparable from its history. Her story, retold across generations, continues to fascinate because it touches on themes that never fade: innocence, power, betrayal, and the resilience of faith. It is the story of a girl who might have lived quietly, known for her learning, her piety, her gentle nature, had fate not placed a crown upon her head. It is the story of how ambition, when unchecked, can destroy even those it claims to exalt. And it is the story of how dignity in suffering can transform a victim into something greater, something eternal. Lady Jane Grey's life was brief, her reign briefer still, yet in the sweep of history she stands luminous. She teaches us that the measure of a life is not always in its length or its worldly accomplishments, but in the character revealed when all else is stripped away. In Jane's calm acceptance of death, in her words of faith, in her serenity before the axe, we see a strength that no crown could give and no executioner could take away. So she remains the 9 Days Queen, the girl whose childhood ended with a throne and whose youth ended with a scaffold, the figure who still compels us to pause, to reflect, to mourn. In her we see the beauty and the cruelty of history, the splendor of crowns and the sorrow they conceal, the fragility of innocence in a world driven by ambition. Her story endures because it is not only the tale of one girl in Tudor England, but the universal story of what it means to be human, caught between the forces of destiny and the desire for a quiet life, between the weight of power and the hope of peace. And as long as the tower stands, as long as the grey stones bear the memory of those who walked to their deaths within its walls, Lady Jane Grey will not be forgotten. Her footsteps echo there still, not in anger but in sorrow, not in bitterness but in grace. She is the child queen who became immortal in tragedy, the lamb crowned and sacrificed, the gentle voice that whispers across centuries that crowns are fleeting, but faith endures forever. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.